For 9 years, I worked the overnight desk at a building where the rule was that you could not cry, where anyone could hear you. I want to tell it plainly because I have told it badly before, to people who needed me to be confused so they could feel sorry for me. I'm not confused. I knew what I was doing for most of it. That is the part I cannot put down. The building was called Halver's Residence, though no one I met ever knew who Halver was. It sat on Deming Street in a city I would rather not name, 11 floors of pre-war brick gone the color of wet cardboard, with a green awning that someone replaced every few years so the front would look cared for, even though nothing behind it was. It was a residential hotel, the kind that used to fill every American downtown, and now survive in the seams of cities where the rent control froze and the families died off and the rooms passed quietly from one lonely person to the next. Single occupancy, shared bathrooms on the even floors, an elevator that worked if you were patient with it, and a staircase that smelled like cold iron and other people's cooking. I took the night job in October. I was 34, and I had just buried my brother. I needed work that did not require me to be a person during daylight hours. That is the honest reason. People assume you take a night job for the money, and the money was part of it. But the truth is, I could not stand the sun for a while. The sun felt like an accusation. At night, the city slowed down and the building got quiet, and I could sit at the desk in the small pool of lamplight and not have to explain my face to anyone. My brother's name was Daniel. He was 4 years younger than me. He drowned in a reservoir 2 hours north of the city in August. I was supposed to be with him that weekend, but I canceled because I had a cold. A head cold. I want to be precise about how small that reason was. I canceled a trip because my nose was running, and my brother went anyway with 2 friends, and at some point in the late afternoon, he swam out further than he should have, and his heart did something it had apparently always been going to do, and he went under between one breath and the next. And the friends did not notice for almost a minute because the water was bright and he had not called out. He did not call out. The medical examiner said the arrhythmia would likely have taken him no matter where he was, that I could have been standing beside him on dry land and watched it happen. I have repeated that sentence to myself maybe 4,000 times. It has never once worked. So, that was what I carried into Halver's in October, and I want you to understand it because the building understood it before I did. The man who hired me was the day manager, a heavy, careful man named Esposito who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and kept a roll of antacids in his shirt pocket. He interviewed me in the lobby because there was no office, just a desk and a wall of brass mail slots, and a back room the size of a closet. He asked me 3 questions about my work history, and then he stopped asking about work entirely and looked at me for a while, and I thought he was going to ask about the gap on my resume, the 2 months after Daniel. Instead, he said, "You don't have anybody depending on you to be home at night?" I told him no. My wife and I had separated the year before. No children. Our parents both gone. He nodded slowly, like that was the right answer, like I had passed something, and that should have been the first thing I noticed. A normal employer wants to know you're reliable. He wanted to know whether I was alone. He walked me through the job in 20 minutes. Answer the phone, which rarely rang. Buzz people in after midnight if they'd lost their key, but only residents, and I'd learn the faces. Log anyone who came or went. Watch the 4 camera feeds on the small monitor, which showed the lobby, the front entrance, the second floor hallway, and the basement laundry. Do a walkthrough of each floor twice a night, at 1 and at 4, checking that the fire doors were latched and nobody was sleeping in the stairwell. And then he handed me a laminated card, the size of an index card, yellowed at the edges, and on it was a list of house rules typed in an old typeface, and most of them were ordinary. No smoking, no guests past 11 p.m. without registration, no cooking appliances above a single hot plate, quiet hours from 10 to 7. The last rule felt different. It was set apart from the others by a line, and it read, "Residents and staff will refrain from audible expressions of grief within the building." I read it twice. I asked Esposito about it, half laughing, because it was an absurd thing to see on a list with no smoking. He didn't laugh. He took the antacids out of his pocket and put 2 in his mouth and chewed them before he answered. And he said, "It's an old building, lot of old people. People die here, you understand. Somebody's neighbor passes. You don't want everybody in the building wailing all night, every night. It's a courtesy, you'll see. It keeps things calm." That made a kind of sense. In a building full of the elderly and the alone, death would be a regular visitor. And there's a logic to not letting grief become contagious in a place where everyone is already barely holding on. I put the card in my shirt pocket. I thought about Daniel, and I thought, a building where I'm not allowed to cry out loud is maybe exactly the building for me. I started that night. The first few weeks were almost nothing. I want to be fair to the building and to myself, and say that for almost 2 months, it was the most peaceful job I have ever had. The residents were mostly invisible. I learned a few of them. There was Mr. Okafor on the 7th floor, a retired bus mechanic who came down at 2 most mornings because he could not sleep, and we'd talk about nothing, baseball and weather, and he'd go back up. There was a woman named Drella, ancient, tiny, who wore a man's overcoat over her nightgown and collected the day's newspapers from the recycling and read them all in the lobby until dawn. There was a younger guy, maybe my age, named Foss, who I think dealt a little out of his room, but was unfailingly polite to me, and once brought me a coffee when it was raining. These were the living. I logged them as they came and went. I watched the cameras. I did my walkthroughs. The first wrong thing was something I rationalized for a long time. On my walkthroughs, I started to notice that the building had more occupied rooms than the mail slots accounted for. There were sounds behind certain doors on the odd-numbered floors, the 3rd and 5th and 9th especially. Low sounds, a radio playing something old, the creak of weight on a floorboard, water running. But when I checked the resident log in the back room, those rooms were marked vacant, and they had no mail slot downstairs, and Esposito never mentioned tenants there. I asked him once, casually. I said, "Somebody living in 511. I keep hearing a radio," and he got very still in a way I would come to know well. And then he said, "Pipes. The radiators talk in this building. You'll get used to it." And he changed the subject so smoothly that I let it go. But it wasn't pipes. I knew it wasn't pipes the way you know a human sound from a building sound. There is a particular quality to a room that has a person in it, a kind of attention, and 511 had it, and 307 had it, and a few others. I started, without quite admitting to myself that I was doing it, to keep my own list. Rooms that were vacant on paper, but occupied in the air. By December, I had 9 of them. The second wrong thing was the crying. I should explain that I cried in those early months more than I have ever cried before or since. Not at the desk. I followed the rule, partly out of respect, and partly because the rule fit my shame, since I did not feel I had earned the right to grieve loudly, I who had been so concerned about a head cold. But there was a back stairwell that went down past the basement to a sub-level the residents never used, a furnace room and some storage, and I found that down there, with the boiler running, I could let go without anyone hearing. I went down there maybe twice a week in the worst of it. I would sit on the bottom step with my back against the cinder block, and I would cry for my brother, ugly and loud, the boiler covering me, and then I would wash my face in the utility sink and go back up and finish my shift. I told myself it was healthy. I was containing it. I was respecting the rule and still taking care of myself. It took me until January to understand that the rule was not about courtesy. It was about feeding. Here is how I came to understand it. There was a man on the 6th floor, a Mr. Reyes, who I knew a little. He'd lost his wife the previous year, before my time, and the other residents spoke of him gently, the way people speak of someone who is not doing well. One night in January, his daughter called the desk phone, which never rang, at around 2 in the morning, and she was crying, and she told me her father had been taken to the hospital that afternoon and had died at 11, and she could not reach the day manager, and she did not know what to do about his room and his things, and could I please write it down so someone would know. I wrote it down. I told her how sorry I was. She cried on the phone for a while and I let her, and then she thanked me and hung up. And the building changed. I felt it. I don't have a better word. The air in the lobby got dense, the way it does before a storm. There was pressure behind my eyes. The lamp on the desk dimmed and held dim for a slow 10 count, and then came back. And on the camera monitor, the 2nd floor hallway feed, which should have been empty, showed a figure standing very still about halfway down, facing the camera. Not moving. I watched it for a full minute. The other 3 feeds were normal. I told myself it was a resident, someone who couldn't sleep, even though it was the wrong floor for any of the residents I knew. And I told myself I would check on my 1 o'clock walkthrough, which I had already done. So I told myself I would check on the 4. When I did my 4 o'clock walkthrough, the 2nd floor was empty. But the door to 207, vacant on paper, was open about a hand's width, and warm air was coming out of it. And inside, in the dark, I heard a woman crying, softly, the specific cadence of the daughter on the phone. I stood in that hallway with my flashlight, and I did not go in. Every animal part of me said, "Do not go in," and I obeyed it, and I went back downstairs, and I sat at the desk until the sun came up, and Esposito arrived. I told him about Reyes. I left out the figure, the open door, and the crying. He wrote it in the log, and then he said, without my asking, "Did anybody make a lot of noise about it?" And I said the daughter had been upset on the phone. And he asked, sharp, "On the phone, not in the building?" And I said, "No, on the phone she wasn't here." And he relaxed, and I understood that I had passed another test I hadn't known I was taking, and that the relief on his face was not about decorum at all. I want to be honest about the next part because it is where I stopped being only a witness. I started watching what happened after a death. I'm a careful person. It's why the desk suited me, and I began keeping records the way I'd kept my list of occupied empty rooms. When a resident died, if the grief stayed quiet, if it stayed outside the building or stayed contained, the building was calm. The pressure I described would build and then ebb, like a tide going back out. But when grief was loud inside Halvers, the building fed, and it grew, and the empty occupied rooms multiplied. The clearest case was Mr. Okafor, my 2 a.m. friend. In February, his son died, his only child, a heart thing, fast, the way my brother went. And Okafor came down to the lobby that night, and he was destroyed. He sat in the chair where Drella read her newspapers, and he wept, and he was not quiet. He was a big man, and his grief was big. And I remembered the rule, and I did the thing I am most ashamed of in this whole account. I shushed him. I went around the desk, and I crouched next to him, and I told him gently, the way you'd tell a child, that he had to keep it down, that it was the rule, that I was so sorry, but he could not cry like that in here. He looked at me with such bewilderment, such hurt, as though I had struck him, and he got up and he went to the elevator and he rode it up alone, and I felt the building's attention pass over me like a hand passing over a flame, almost approving, and I told myself I had spared him something. I told myself the rule was protection. Mr. Okafor's room was on the 7th floor. Within a week, there was a new occupied empty room on the 7th floor, 709, 3 doors from his, that had been vacant on paper and in the air for all my months there, and was now, suddenly, occupied. And when I passed it on my walkthroughs, I would hear, very faint, a big man weeping, and it was not Mr. Okafor, because Mr. Okafor was still alive, still came down some nights, quieter now, hollowed out. The crying in 709 was the grief he had not been allowed to finish. It had been taken from him and put behind a door, and it would weep there, I understood, forever. That is the logic of the thing, as much as I was ever able to piece it together. The building does not kill people. I want to be clear about that, because it would almost be easier if it did. It harvests grief, not the people, the grief. When someone in Halvers mourns out loud, the building takes the sound, the feeling, the unbearable living weight of it, and it keeps it. It gives it a room. Each of those occupied empty doors is a grief that someone was not allowed to finish carrying, kept warm and weeping in the dark, and the building grows fat on them, and in return it gives the living a terrible gift, which is relief. The people who obeyed the rule, who shushed themselves, who took their crying outside or down to the boiler room, or swallowed it whole, they got lighter. They moved on. Mr. Okafor, 3 months after his son, was eating in the lobby and laughing at something on Drella's newspaper. and a man should not laugh 3 months after his only child. And I knew where the rest of him had gone. It was on the 7th floor with the door shut. And I had helped. The rule, the shushing, the contained crying in the boiler room. I thought I had been protecting myself and others. I had been delivering. Every time I cried in the sub-basement, with the boiler covering the sound, I was not hiding my grief from the building. I was bringing it down to the boiler room and giving it directly to the foundation, where the building keeps the deepest and oldest things. I had been feeding it Daniel for months. That is why I had felt lighter. That is why, by spring, I could think about my brother and feel only a clean and manageable sadness, the kind you can live beside. The unbearable part, the part that had me on the floor of my apartment in September, was not gone. It had been taken out of me and put somewhere in that building, and it was down there, in the dark, near the boiler, crying with my own voice, and I had carried it down there on my own 2 feet. I understood it fully on a night in April, and I will tell you how, because it is the night the woman comes into the story, and she is the reason I am telling any of this at all. Her name was June. She moved into 402 in March, which was unusual. A new young resident in a building of the old and the stranded. She was maybe 40, a nurse, recently divorced, taking a cheap room while she got back on her feet. And she had her mother with her, an old woman with dementia who could not be left alone, and who June was nursing herself because she could not afford anything else. The mother was named Alba. June worked days at a hospital and sat with her mother at night, and sometimes in the small hours when Alba was settled, June would come down to the lobby to be around another human being for a few minutes, and we talked. She was the first person in that building who felt fully, vividly alive, who had a future she was reaching toward, and I think I half fell for her in the way a lonely person does when someone finally feels ordinary and kind. I knew Alba was dying. June knew it too. She was a nurse. She could read the signs better than any doctor. And one night in April, talking to her at the desk, with the laminated rule card in my shirt pocket where it had lived for 6 months, I felt the whole thing tip over inside me. Because I realized that when Alba died, June was going to grieve, and June was a loud, full, living person. And she was going to grieve out loud in the building, holding her dead mother, and the building was going to take it. It was going to take the deepest part of June, the daughter part, and shut it behind a door on some floor, and June was going to get lighter and move on and live her future and never know that the truest piece of her was weeping in the dark on Deming Street. And I could not let it. I want that to be the one clean thing in this account. There came a point where I could not let it happen to her, and that point was the only moment in 9 years. I think I acted like the man my brother believed I was. I tried to warn her. That was my first mistake, because the building does not allow warning, not directly. I sat her down on a slow night, and I tried to tell her about the rule, about the rooms, about what I had seen, and the words came out of me wrong. They came out as the rambling of a grief-sick night clerk, and I watched her face go from interest to concern to the careful, neutral kindness that a nurse gives to someone she has decided is not well. The more clearly I tried to explain it, the less believable I sounded, And I realized later that this is part of the mechanism too, that the building had made me into exactly the kind of witness no one believes. A lonely man who had buried his brother and worked nights and obviously, poor thing, had not processed his loss. June was gentle with me. She suggested I talk to someone. She meant it kindly, and I understood that I could not save her with the truth, because the truth had been built over months into something that discredited me the moment I spoke it. So I tried to save her with a lie and a plan. Alba died on a Tuesday morning in May, around 4. June came to the desk before she called anyone, because I think by then I was the closest thing she had to a friend in that place, and she was very calm in the way nurses are at the moment of death. And she said, "It's done. She's gone. I need to make some calls." And she was holding herself so tightly, this living woman, and I could see the grief stacked up behind her eyes like water behind a dam. And I knew the dam was going to break, and it was going to break here, in the building, and the building was already waking up around us. The pressure was building behind my eyes. The lamp was dimming. I did the only thing I could think of. I told her she couldn't grieve here. I told her the same thing I'd told Mr. Okafor, but this time I knew what I was protecting her from, and I begged. I told her there was a diner 2 blocks over that was open all night, a real place. Lights and people and coffee and a waitress named Sonia I half knew. And I told her to go there right now, before she let anything out. To go be among the living in a place with no history and no hunger, and to cry there, to wail there, to put her whole self into it, where it would belong to her and nobody else. I told her I would handle the calls, the ambulance, the body, all the machinery of it, that I would take care of everything in the building, so she did not have to be in the building for 1 second of her grief. She thought I was insane. Of course she did. She had a dead mother upstairs, and the night clerk was telling her to go to a diner. She started to argue, and the building was waking. The figure was on the second-floor monitor again, and a door somewhere above us had opened. I could feel the warm air starting to move down the stairwell, and I did the second thing I am ashamed of, though it is a smaller shame than the first. I grabbed her by the shoulders, and I lied to her plainly. I told her I had lost my brother, which was true, and I told her that the worst mistake I had made was grieving him alone in an empty place, which was also true in a way she could not know. And I told her that if she loved her mother, she would not let the first hour of her grief happen in a building full of strangers behind closed doors, that she owed Alba a clean goodbye in the light. And something in that reached her. The nurse in her stepped back, and the daughter stepped forward, and she nodded, shaking. And she let me put her coat over her shoulders, and she went out the front door under the green awning into the dark, toward the diner, with her grief still locked inside her, to go and finally let it out somewhere the building could not reach. And it worked. I want to say that clearly. For a few minutes it worked. The pressure in the lobby crested, and then, finding nothing to take, it began to recede. The lamp came back up. The figure left the second-floor monitor. June was 2 blocks away in a bright diner, crying into a cup of coffee with a stranger named Sonia rubbing her back, and the grief was hers, all of it, every unbearable ounce, and the building got nothing. I had broken the pattern. For about 20 minutes I sat at that desk, and I felt something I had not felt since the reservoir, which was that I had been in the right place at the right time, and I had not failed someone. I had been there for Daniel after all, not for Daniel, but for someone. Then the building turned toward me, because that is the part of the story I had not understood, that there is always a balance, that a grief denied to the building does not simply disappear, it has to be paid, and if the mourner is gone, then it takes the price from whoever remains. I should have known when the boiler room came into my mind. I had not been down there in weeks. But sitting at the desk in that warm, clean relief, I found myself thinking about my brother, and the thought was not the clean, manageable sadness I had grown used to. It was the whole thing. It was September on my apartment floor. It came up in me all at once, all the grief I thought I had handled, every ounce I had carried down to the boiler over the months, and it came back into me with interest. And I understood, sitting there, that the building had been keeping it for me, and now it was returning it, all of it, because I had cheated it of June's, and it wanted me to mourn out loud, here, now, so it could finally have mine. And I wanted to. God help me. After months of that false lightness, the grief was so real and so total that I wanted nothing more than to put my head down on that desk and howl for my brother until something broke. The relief of it would have been like drowning. In that moment, I thought I understood what Daniel felt, the not calling out, the going under quietly because the water was bright and the breath was already gone. I understood that the building had set this for me from the first interview, that Esposito had not been looking for a reliable employee, but for a grieving man with no one waiting at home, a man already most of the way down, a man who would learn the rule and obey it and feed it his own brother, and finally, when the time was right, be made to give the rest. The occupied empty room with my name on it was already somewhere above me, had been waiting all along, and all I had to do was open my mouth. I bit down on my own hand until it bled. I am not being dramatic. I have the scar, a white crescent on the meat below my thumb. I bit down and I did not make a sound, and I held it, and the grief rose and crested and screamed inside the box of my own body where the building could not reach it. And it lasted, I think, around an hour, though it felt like the rest of my life. I sat at that desk and grieved my brother completely, silently, with blood running down my wrist, and I gave the building nothing, not one sound, and slowly, slowly, the way a tide goes out, it receded. And I was still myself, diminished, shaking, but whole. The grief was inside me where it belonged, finally mine the way it should have been since August, heavy and permanent and survivable. June came back at dawn. Soon after, the ambulance came for Alba. June was wrung out and human and grieving correctly, in the open, the way the living are supposed to, and she thanked me without knowing for what. And within a few weeks she had moved out of Halvers entirely, found a better place across the city, took her grief with her into a future I am told she is still living. She got out whole. She is the one good thing I did. I have never told her any of this, and I never will, because there is nothing in it she needs. I worked another 7 years at that desk. You may wonder why. I have asked myself, and the only answer I have is that I had finally understood what the building was, and that I was the only one who did, and that as long as I sat there, I could do the small thing I learned to do, which was to send people to the diner. I could not save them all. Most of them were already behind their doors before I knew their loss, especially the old ones, the ones who shushed themselves before I ever knew what they were carrying. But now and then someone would lose someone and come down to the lobby, raw and breaking, and I would know the look, and I would put their coat over their shoulders and tell them about the diner 2 blocks over and the waitress named Sonia. And some of them I got out the door before the building woke. And those griefs are out in the world now, carried by the people they belong to, instead of weeping behind a door on Deming Street forever. I kept count. Over 7 years, I think I saved 19. I quit when Esposito retired, and the man who replaced him handed me a new laminated card, fresh, the typeface cleaner, the rules updated, but the last one unchanged below its dividing line, and asked me the same question Esposito had asked, whether I had anybody depending on me to be home at night. And I understood that he was not really asking me. He was asking the building's question on the building's behalf, looking for the next one. And I understood that I had become, over 9 years, exactly the kind of trusted old hand who would be expected to train my replacement, to hand the card to some newly bereaved man with nobody waiting and teach him the rule and tell him it was a courtesy. I could not do it. I will not pretend it was only principle. Part of it was simply that I was tired, and I was afraid that if I stayed, I would do it, that I would hand the card across the desk the way Esposito handed it to me, because the building is patient and it wears you down, and complicity is so much lighter to carry than refusal. So I left. I do not live in that city anymore. But here is the thing I still cannot put down. The reason I have told this badly to people who needed me confused. When I grieved my brother that night at the desk, silently, with my hand in my mouth, I kept all of it. I won. And the grief I kept has never once gotten lighter in all the years since, because I never gave any of it away. Not to a boiler room, not to a building, not to anything. I carry the whole weight of Daniel every day, undimmed, the September floor weight of him, and it is exactly as heavy now as it was the night I bit down. Sometimes, on bad nights, I understand why the people behind those doors went so willingly. I understand the relief they were offered. I think about how light Mr. Okafor was 3 months after his son, laughing at Drella's newspaper, and some cowardly part of me is not sure he chose wrong, and I hate that part of me, and I cannot get rid of it, because it is grief too, and I am keeping all of my grief now, even that. I still have the card, the original one yellowed that Esposito gave me my first night. I do not know why I took it when I left. It's in a drawer, and I look at it more than I should. Residents and staff will refrain from audible expressions of grief within the building. I used to read it as a cruelty. Now, on the worst nights, when the weight of my brother is on my chest, and I want so badly to set even a little of it down somewhere, I read it as a temptation. And the awful thing, the thing I cannot tell the people who need me confused, is that I am not always sure I would refuse it twice.